Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for joining me. This week's guest is Ambassador John Bolton. He served as National Security Advisor, one of many, to Donald Trump in his first term. I'm a big fan of his book, his memoir, his account of his time as NSA, The Room Where It Happened. And you might remember, keen listeners, when I interviewed John Hennessy, who we'll mention in this podcast. He works for John Bolton, and we were discussing Taiwan. And you may remember or recall that I leaned back and pulled that book off my shelf, and John and I discussed a very important passage in John Bolton's book about Trump's view on Taiwan. So we'll discuss that a little bit later in this podcast too. It's quite good. So just a little note. We recorded this interview earlier this week, mainly because, as you can imagine, John Bolton is hugely sought after for his commentary. And so his schedule just only allowed the window earlier this week, which means this interview was recorded before the bombshell announcement that came out over the last few days from, well, the Russians and the US, essentially with a 28-point peace plan that would essentially ask Ukraine to capitulate. So we do not discuss that in this interview, and you will note at the end of this podcast, we do discuss Ukraine without taking in those most recent developments. That's the reason why. If you have any comments, if you have any suggestions, if you have feedback, good or bad, you know where to find me. You can absolutely send me your thoughts. I would love to hear them all. Ambassador John Bolton, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Firstly, how would you describe Donald Trump's foreign policy that we've seen in the first year of Trump 2.0 compared to the chaos and the disorder that we saw during the time you were National Security Advisor and, of course, that entire first administration?
Well, I really don't think there's much difference because Trump doesn't start with a philosophy. He doesn't have a grand strategy in national security issues. He really doesn't even do policy the way most people understand that term. He's been described as transactional, ad hoc, episodic, and really seeing things through the prism of what benefits Donald Trump. So, if anything, I would say the behavior he's displayed in the second term is more on the record, a lot of what we saw in private in the first term, but he didn't get into it in public. Now he's surrounded by advisors that basically say yes, sir, to him. And unlike the first term, that's one lesson he learned is don't surround yourself with people who consider the consequences of your actions, look at the facts, come to the most informed decision possible. So it's like the first term, I guess, only more so.
One difference I think we are seeing, though, is his obsession with wanting to end wars and be the peacemaker. Now, we may share some views on why we think his motivations are that way, but do you think ultimately he's maybe a pacifist?
No, I think it's about Donald Trump. And this was true in the first term. He was very resentful that Barack Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009. That was in Obama's first term. He didn't think Obama had done anything to deserve it. And I think there's a good argument he's correct. And in Obama's first year, there really wasn't enough time to do anything. And many people thought Obama received the Nobel Peace Prize for who he was rather than what he did. But just because Trump may be correct that Obama didn't deserve the Peace Prize, that doesn't mean that he deserved it. But he talked about it quite a bit, and he tried to get people to nominate him for the Peace Prize even back then. So now it's even more an obsession. And you can see by the way he approaches many of these things, it's with an eye to the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. And he's claimed that he solved, I think the latest total is 8 wars in his first 8 months. In at least 2 of those cases, the countries involved didn't even know they were at war. But, leaving that aside, this is how Trump can oversimplify really complex international situations in aid of something he wants, which in this case is the Nobel Prize.
One of the more interesting developments that does go to the heart of one of the few things Trump is consistent about is tariffs. And he's announced over the weekend that he's going to start rolling some of those back. Now, tariffs were introduced on my native Australia. We have a free trade agreement with you. We don't even have a trade surplus with the United States. And yet somehow we get tariffs on steel and a 10% blanket tariff. I think that caused enormous damage, not to the alliance itself, but certainly in the public mood in Australia about the United States. Do you think these tariffs have been worth it?
Well, absolutely not. Trump, during the 2024 campaign, used to say that his favorite word in the dictionary was tariff. And he did buy this argument by some of his advisors that you could build up tariff walls that would bring investment and jobs back to the United States that had been lost by low cost foreign competition. I don't think that argument is right. I don't think the tariffs that he introduced on April the 2nd of this year were nearly high enough to accomplish that objective. What they were tariffs that introduced irritants into relations with most of our friends around the world. I think most Americans, certainly most Republicans, remain free traders at heart. There are areas where national security may be involved, or other countries are not complying with their obligations and things like non-tariff barriers. But those problems exist, but they can be dealt with ways other than a general tariff war. And I think that what Trump didn't calculate was along the lines of what you just said. He didn't see that he was shredding decades of effort by presidents of both parties in this country to build up relationships of trust and good faith and reliance with our friends and allies, because Trump only thinks in terms of balance sheets and dollars and cents. And he didn't see the harm he was causing and continues to cause, not just by the tariffs themselves, but by the erratic way in which he announces them. So in the case, for example, of an ad run by the province of Ontario showing pictures of Ronald Reagan giving a free trade speech when he was president, Trump added 10% to the Canadian tariff level. This is just nonsensical, and the tariffs don't have a compelling economic basis to begin with, and the harm they've caused the United States around the world, I think, has been very significant.
Are you surprised to see Trump starting to roll those back?
No, because it fits into that central objective for Trump, which is the benefit of Donald Trump. So, notwithstanding Trump's claims about how great the American economy is doing, and certainly it's very strong in terms of financial investments, artificial intelligence progress, that sort of thing, many people still worry about inflation. They're worried about job security. And the prices at the supermarkets are still high. Maybe they're not rising as fast, but they're still higher than they were years ago. And I think Trump was elected in some substantial part based on voters who thought Biden had not handled the economy well, did not think Kamala Harris would do so either, and looked at Trump as a safe pair of hands. If he loses that vote, Republicans in Congress in 26 could be in big trouble in their reelection effort. So tariffs, his favorite word in the dictionary, if it gets in the way of the greater glory of Donald Trump, away they go.
So I watch a lot of interviews you give, Ambassador Bolton. You speak a lot about Iran, but I really want to focus this discussion on the Indo-Pacific. And it strikes me that during Trump 1.0, the Indo-Pacific did very well. Trump had good relations with the Japanese PM. This time around, I think we're seeing a lot of unease in the Indo-Pacific around Trump. Trump has been quite jittery. He announced this review into AUKUS. Well, the Pentagon did, Elbridge Colby did. Now, that program is safe. But all the same, it does seem that the Indo-Pacific is not having the secure relations that they enjoyed in the first term. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think over time, Trump's isolationist impulses became clearer. I don't mean to imply that this is some carefully thought out doctrine that Trump follows, but it's where his neuron flashes tend to go. And I do think that there are people in his administration who are, starting with the vice president, J.D. Vance, frankly, who are much more philosophically isolationist. So it's not just a Trump problem in Trump 2.0, and it's something to continue to be concerned about. I think that the threats in the Indo-Pacific are increasing. I think China's hegemonic aspirations along its Indo-Pacific periphery are real. I think there was progress over several administrations to begin to deal with that. I think the Asian Security Quad, Australia, Japan, India, and the U.S., something that had been around in one form or another for some time, but really was promoted by Shinzo Abe when he was Prime Minister of Japan. A very logical development, had a lot of promise to it. In Trump's first term, when we got him together with Quad prime ministers and in the one actual Quad meeting, all he wanted to do was talk about tariffs. And the bigger strategic picture of the threat from China and what we could do about it really faded into the background. And I think that's part of what causes the unease in the Indo-Pacific today is that it still doesn't appear that Trump fully grasps the nature of the threat from China. He's still in search of what he called in the first term the biggest trade deal in history. And I think his recent meeting with Xi Jinping bears that out. We'll see how things progress, but at the moment, I just don't think Trump or his administration have a coherent strategy to deal with China or the Indo-Pacific as a whole.
That's so interesting you say that. What is the distinction? Is it that people like you, Mike Pompeo, maybe there's some other names you want to offer, Matt Pottinger, were they keeping a more cohesive direction to your China policy that it's now apparent is not there? And you talk about the Quad. We're not having a Quad leaders meeting this year because of Trump's treatment of Modi, and Modi is very injured by this. Do you think that the progress you made during Trump 1.0 on China and getting the allies together like this, do you think that's broken down, and how serious do you think that might be?
Well, I think it's in jeopardy. It's, we're 1 year in, we'll see what happens next. I do think that in one piece of it, the cooperation between Japan and South Korea in terms of trilateral military maneuvers with the United States appears to be holding. I think it's worth considering bringing South Korea into the Quad, making it a 5-party agreement. I think there's a lot that can be done in ways that take the AUKUS model and bring Japan into cooperation, bring South Korea, India into cooperation. We shouldn't be looking at a NATO kind of framework. I don't think that fits at this point in the region, but there are a lot of ways less than that we can cooperate. It's just that Trump isn't thinking about that on his own, and I don't think there are people around him who are really pushing him in that direction. So there's a lot of focus on domestic U.S. issues and what some people call the Western Hemisphere focus, speaking today about Venezuela in particular. But it just speaks generally to the lack of a global approach and the ad hoc way that Trump looks out after problems.
One of the more surprising things Trump said recently, he says lots of surprising things, of course, was that he was going to do an AUKUS deal with South Korea and offer them nuclear submarines. Do you think that's got any legs? That came as a big shock to Australians.
Well, I think that South Korea really needs to play a larger role in East Asia and the Pacific. They obviously have a legitimate concern about North Korea, and given the history between the two halves of the peninsula, and they look directly at China across the West Sea, as they call it. But I think South Korea is beginning to look in bigger picture terms. They see they're part of a larger threat environment. They understand, as Japan does, I think already, that a Chinese threat to Taiwan is a threat to South Korea too. So I would hope that they would begin looking at the larger context. And they've been a close ally of the United States for 50 years, and Australia that fought in the Korean War. So bringing them into a larger role in some kind of collective self-defense structures, I think would make a lot of sense.
But would you, if you were NSA now, would you be giving over nuclear submarines to South Korea? I thought it was such a big deal that even when Australia got it, that it was something that Elbridge Colby's on the record saying he would have thought twice about that.
Yeah, well, I think there are times when you have to look at what the threat environment is, and we're not talking about nuclear weapons here. I think that's a very, very different circumstance, of course. And I think we've got to introduce the idea more broadly that nuclear power is safe and secure. Our friends in New Zealand still don't necessarily buy that in terms of American nuclear-powered ships. But it's
same in Australia. I mean, we don't even have nuclear power. We've got a ban on nuclear power. Full stop.
Yeah. Well, soon you'll have nuclear-powered submarines, and that may turn things around. But that's part of the changing environment that I think we have to adjust to. And I don't expect that it will take place overnight, but I think it's important to keep moving on a variety of fronts. We need some new creative thinking. The China threat is very different from the Soviet threat during the Cold War. China is a major economic force. The Soviet Union never was. And we have to take into account how much more serious an adversary the Chinese communist-led China is.
So really interestingly, at that bilateral with Anthony Albanese, I was there, and again, one of the more surprising things Trump said, although this one I think was a bit more welcome, was he actually stated out loud AUKUS is about deterring China and from Taiwan. Then he went on to say, here's the caveat, he goes on to say, my relationship with Xi is such that Xi won't move on Taiwan. Do you think that's a misguided view from Trump about the strength of his relationship with Xi, noting that he has not been able to use his relationship with Putin to end that war in Ukraine?
Right. Well, Trump, because he doesn't think in policy terms, views international relations through the prism of his personal relations with foreign leaders. So he thinks if he has a good personal relationship with Xi Jinping, then state-to-state relations between the U.S. and China are good. Likewise for Vladimir Putin, for Kim Jong-un of North Korea. After he met Kim for the first time, he said to reporters, we fell in love. And so everything was great between the U.S. and North Korea. I'll guarantee you that's not the way Kim Jong-un looked at the situation. Personal relations have their role in international affairs like everything else, but for the hard men who run authoritarian countries, they know what they think their national interests are, and that's what they pursue. So Trump is badly off course if he thinks that personal relations alone are going to protect Taiwan. And I think we should be worried about Taiwan. I think the difficulties inside China itself actually enhance the danger for Taiwan. It's part of the authoritarian playbook when you've got domestic difficulties, in this case in China, the aging population, the unsteadiness of the economy, the effects of the one child per family policy. If you can point to something like Taiwan and say that's the source of our problem, you can unite a country that might otherwise be fragmented. So I do think the Chinese threat is real and something that we have to worry about. It's not going to be solved even if Trump reaches the biggest trade deal in history with China. Taiwan is a neuralgic issue for them, and I don't think our administration currently knows exactly what to do to deal with it.
Do you think that Donald Trump publicly messaging that in front of an ally like Australia that is, by the way, pouring enormous sums into acquiring these submarines so we can help deter China, do you think that actually makes the environment even more dangerous? Because he's essentially saying to people, you can afford to be laconic about this threat. I've got it under control, when, as you're saying, it's really not under control.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sometimes a fine line. You want to make sure your public is aware of what the threats are, why they're being asked to spend a lot of money on high technology weapon systems, why it's dangerous to ignore the problem. And you don't want to overstate the threat or understate it. And that's just something Trump doesn't think about. He talks about what's right in front of him and often doesn't consider the implications, which for a president can be dangerous.
What do you think are the calculations going on in China about how Trump is operating vis-a-vis Taiwan?
I think that the pressure in Beijing is to show at least they're making progress toward bringing Taiwan back under their control. And there are a number of close observers who think that the threat is really intense over the next 5-year period, especially because of China's demographics. As its population declines, its economy won't grow as fast, its capabilities translated into military power won't be as great. So actually, this decline enhances the risk in the near term. I think that we've got to consider the ways China might pressure Taiwan. I don't personally believe that their chosen course is to invade the island. I think it's too risky for them. And they want the full productivity of Taiwan. They want the chip manufacturing assets and everything else on that amazing island, one of the most productive countries in the world, really. So I think what China would aim to do is create a political crisis under some pretext and then throw a blockade around Taiwan and see what the U.S., Japan, and others in the region do. That's where the danger is. And that's where the isolationist impulse in the administration come into play. If somebody says, but Taiwan is all the way across the Pacific, it's a blockade, why are we going to fight to break through? I would worry that that isolationist argument could prevail. So that's why it's important, I think, for others in the region to try to keep pushing to make clear that we oppose these hegemonic aspirations of China. That's why the Quad was such an effective mechanism, and if it could be made to work again, I think would really provide a measure of political protection for Taiwan that's not present when, especially, we don't have India in the picture.
So, to be clear, what do you think allies like Australia, Japan, South Korea should do? I must say, I think it feels that these allies are slightly adrift when it comes to Taiwan now? Because we don't know, as you say, that the US will definitely show up. What is the best course besides keeping that pressure on? Do we need to be more proactive in our own defenses? What is it?
Yeah, I think everybody has to look at the increased risk we face around the world. I think the China-Russia axis is something that people in Europe are really just beginning to fully understand. I think because in the Asia Pacific, people have been watching China for a long time. Adding Russia just makes it a little bit worse. It's not a lot worse, but it's a series of problems all along the periphery of that landmass that China and Russia represent. And I'm worried that because of Trump's lack of focus, we may end up with a crisis necessary to galvanize people. But I think if Australia and Japan in particular could work with India to say, look, we've got these problems. We know Trump is erratic, but we have our national security interest to think about. Let's the three of us work together to try and get Trump re-engaged. I think that approach might be helpful.
Do you think there is a case that can be made to Trump on Taiwan? I love the anecdote in your book. One of your former, I think, staffers, John Hennessy, who was an ambassador in Palau, we discussed this great anecdote in your book, and he was a very complimentary of you, just so you know. But you seem to suggest in your memoir that Trump was very willing to give up Taiwan. Trump has continued strategic ambiguity when he's asked about Taiwan since. Do you think there's a case that can be made to him in this environment today now?
I think clearly, notwithstanding efforts to build chip manufacturing facilities in the United States and elsewhere, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation is critical to the entire information infrastructure around the world. And to have that fall into Beijing's hands would be a real problem for everybody. So the way to convince Trump is to say he would look very bad if something like that happened. Don't forget about national security arguments. It's how Donald Trump would look. And he doesn't want to be a loser. He always wants to be a winner. This is a way to be a winner, to make it clear to China to remove the strategic ambiguity, that there would be a U.S. response, there would be a response from other people. Deterrence at this point is what we need to message to the Chinese communists, not the ambiguity. There's one thing when Henry Kissinger was practicing strategic ambiguity, but not everybody's Henry Kissinger. So sometimes you have to be much more direct. And I think on Taiwan, that's the right course.
You referenced before the isolationism that sits within the Republican Party, or for better or worse now, MAGA. Do you think that extends to Taiwan? So if we have a presidency beyond Donald Trump and that's Xi's window to move, are you worried about that? I almost think there is slightly a benefit to Trump in that he's just a little bit mad, so you don't know necessarily what he will do, as we saw in Iran. Is your fear also that beyond Trump, when we take away that and we actually have just deep isolationism, that could be a more dangerous period for America?
Well, I think when Trump leaves the political scene, I think most of the Republican Party will snap back to being a Reagan-Bush kind of party. In my conversations with members of Congress and others, I hear all the time that they don't agree with much of what Trump does, but they're just afraid of standing up and saying it. They don't want to face the political consequences. So the good news is they don't agree with Trump in this isolationist direction. Bad news is they haven't been willing to assert themselves. Now, we may be at a point in time when the Republican Party is beginning to break from Trump, when the MAGA movement is beginning to fragment. There are a lot of indications of that domestically. Frankly, it's taken a long time. It's overdue, but I do think it's underway. People are realizing there is life after Trump and there needs to be a Republican Party after Trump. And if there's really one area of bipartisan agreement in Washington over the past 4 or 5 years, it's been that the threat from China is very real. And so this is something that where people have found common ground, and concern for Taiwan has been a major element of that. So I think that Trump is always up for grabs. You never know necessarily what he's going to do, even though I do believe his propensity is toward isolationism. There are ways to change that, and I think that's something we've got to be thinking about continuously.
When you were NSA, we didn't have this very visible axis of Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China operating. What do you think that means for Indo-Pacific, but also Euro-Atlantic collaboration now? It does seem we're now all in these things together, and that what happens in Ukraine, whether or not that war gets resolved, might have some very direct implications for the Indo-Pacific.
I think this is a very important point, and certainly I stress it when I'm talking to people in Europe, and I say the same in the Indo-Pacific. Look, right now you've got North Korean troops fighting with the Russians in Ukraine. The first time Asian troops have been in Eastern and Central Europe probably since Genghis Khan. At the same time, you've got South Korea selling Poland artillery and ammunition. You had Japan and South Korea really urging NATO to set up full-scale liaison offices in their countries, blocked by countries like France and Germany that are just focused on Europe. But I think this is beginning to change in Europe. And I think the reception Taiwan has gotten, for example, in the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, other countries in Europe that appreciate the Russian threat they face, and certainly therefore appreciate the Chinese threat that Taiwan faces. So it's a point where a conflict in Europe and Ukraine really is related to what's happening with Iran and its support for terrorism and nuclear weapons in the Middle East and the Chinese threat to Taiwan. These are linked, and everybody who's affected by the threat should consider that and consider how they can make themselves stronger and increase deterrence against attack by working not just in their region, but on a more global basis.
So Donald Trump said he would finish the Russia-Ukraine war in 24 hours. I asked him about this actually, and he got very sensitive and said it was much more complex than that. Well, who would have guessed? Why do you think he does not want to stop this war? Because actually the US could. It could ring up Putin and Xi and say, right, this is it, boys. This is what we do if you don't get out of there. What do you think is stopping Donald Trump from doing that?
Well, when he said he would end the war in 24 hours, I think he believed his good friend Vladimir Putin, as a personal favor to him, would find a way to resolve it. Well, that was never going to happen. And now he's had 9 months, basically, where he's tried and failed. So I think what he's trying to do now is he doesn't want Ukraine to lose because that would make him look very bad. But he doesn't necessarily want to leave the field, therefore, for Russia to win. So he's trying through a variety of different things to give something to Ukraine, something to Russia, but basically withdraw. Remember, Trump thinks the world is made up of two kinds of people. There are winners and there are losers. Right now, he's not winning anything in trying to resolve the Ukraine-Russia war. He doesn't see the prospects. He doesn't see how to do it. So he doesn't want to be known as a loser. He's just kind of trying to back away from it. That's not to say he may not come back to it. But at the moment, unfortunately, I think the prospect is the war just grinds on for an unforeseeable amount of time.
Yeah, I really share that view too. I think his patience is running out. Do you believe or buy into any of these arguments that MAGA is too close to Russia, potentially infiltrated by Russia or even corrupted by Russia?
Well, there are a lot of things that are very hard to explain, and whether influencers and commentators are paid by foreign sources, you never really know. But a lot of strange voices have emerged who say they're on the right in American political terms. A lot of anti-Semitism now coming out into the open, which is very disturbing. So I think it's something that has to be cleaned up. The damage has to be minimized during Trump's presidency, but there's a lot of work to do to make sure that this kind of attitude doesn't spread within the Republican Party. It's something that's very worrying, and I think we're coming to the realization a little bit late, so there's a lot of work to do.
You mentioned influences. Do you not think it exists inside the administration?
Well, I think it does for reasons that are difficult to understand, except that many people think that's where the big part of the MAGA base is, and therefore they're trying to satisfy it. I don't really think people have out in the countryside have thought this through. I think that support for Ukraine, for example, remains very strong within the Republican Party, and I hope that continues.
And just finally, I couldn't let you go without asking why, you've become this Trump critic. Many would say Trump is legally prosecuting you now because you are a critic of his. Why do you continue? Why do you not just be like many of those Republicans you mentioned who are too scared to talk up and just waiting for Trump to depart the scene?
Well, I'm not sure I would see any alternative. This is what I've done for a long time, is to try and outline what I think is the best national security policy for the United States. And I do think Trump is running a retribution presidency, but I have no intention of letting him silence me.
Well, good luck, Ambassador John Bolton. I really appreciate your time and thanks for joining the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.